Hello everyone and welcome. Sit back, relax, make a cup of tea or whatever you like to drink and get ready for new stories from Yellowcat. Send your own favorite stories in the comments below and maybe they'll be in our new video. So, subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed yet and let's get started. What? Okay, then I quit. Story have you got? I left college with a degree in fine art and a large amount of debt. I was aware that my first job out of college wouldn't be the best, but I wasn't ready for just how bad it would be. I was hired by a business that marketed promotional goods. They basically plastered a company's logo on everything. Well, they weren't the ones who actually did it. They were just the middlemen who set up the art file and sent them to the businesses that produced the things. Anyhow, my responsibility there was to prepare the art file and send it for printing. This was a mostly quantity over quality job, as most of the work just required me to make an existing logo a certain size. Some projects required more work than others, such as when it was necessary to rebuild logos, since some clients lacked a high-resolution file, or better yet, when it was possible to design unique t-shirts and have them made. They had a lot of salespeople who all brought in new business every day, but there was only one designer on staff, me. I put in a lot of effort to follow their instructions and make sure nothing lagged too far behind. I was frequently praised for being the best designer they had ever employed. I was, however, not producing enough money to support myself. I was unable to afford food, rent, or student loans. I put off paying my student loans, however, you can only do it temporarily. After 9 months, there would be a review, and if they would give me a raise, I had been assured. Well, that time finally came, and my boss told me that he couldn't give me a raise because I hadn't been staying late often enough. I was furious. Nobody had ever expressed dissatisfaction over the pace of their labor. I was frequently praised for being the company's fastest designer. I immediately resigned. Later, I found out that it took them a very long time to find a replacement for me, which significantly reduced their income. In the end, they had to hire 4 people to replace me, and to pay each of them more than $30,000 a year, while I was only making $20,000. I had a job at a historical society. Because it was part-time work, there were hour restrictions, both weekly and yearly. In order to prepare for the winter, most individuals would labor tirelessly during the summer. Better hours were available if you stayed longer. I spent 3 years working there since they were always whining about not having enough personnel, so I frequently worked 6 days a week until I was almost at my yearly maximum, at which point they would drastically reduce my hours to the point that I had to acquire a second job. But because this history museum frequently changed my schedule at the last minute within 48 hours, it was difficult for me to work my second job and get childcare for my infant. As a result, I routinely called off and received criticism for failing to show up for my shifts. After a while, I had had enough and sent a curt email to the scheduler informing them that it was improper to change the schedule with only 48 hours notice when we had to give at least a month's notice of our availability. You could have assumed that I would have cursed at her and detonated a bomb in the structure. I was first yelled at by my supervisor before being hauled into HR and put in such a humiliating position that I wasn't even permitted to respond to their charges and rebukes. I was then instructed to get back to work and stop complaining after being put back on the floor. I hadn't worked in 3 weeks after that. I believe they removed me from the schedule as punishment. For some reason, thinking they would get over it because they were so desperate for employees to work additional hours, I put up with this and anxiously awaited the schedule for the following month. So the next month comes out. It's December. I was booked for 1 day, a full month, eve of Christmas. I was angry, but I knew that whining wouldn't solve anything. I held off until that morning before leaving, permanently. To fill the shift, my manager had to come in herself. She and the museum are garbage. I operated a cafe by myself for over 4 years, large one as well. We had received accolades like you wouldn't believe, and throughout my tenure there, I had succeeded in increasing sales by just under 300%. For that location, I bled, never took breaks or vacations, always went above and above and gave my all. The owners took a relatively passive role, went on vacations abroad 4 or 5 times a year, would each actively work in the company for roughly 8 hours per week. Last year, I informed them in June that I would be taking a week off during Christmas. It was the first vacation I had planned, and I was going to visit my seriously ill father. I'm unsure if he'd make it ill, for example. That's okay, they got it. I had a great staff in place that could handle things without me. I received a text message from the owner 2 weeks prior to my planned vacation saying, "So we've decided to fly to Australia for Christmas. The flights were simply reserved. We must cancel your time off since, as manager, we expect you to be working in the cafe while we're away." No excuses. Not a thing. So, I quit immediately. Later, I found out that they went bankrupt and the cafe closed for good. Apparently, 8 hours a week is not good enough to run a business, and they couldn't find a dedicated manager like me. I don't feel sorry for them one bit. Redditors, have you ever organized a coup and overthrown a local HOA? One of my rental properties in New York City, where I manage buildings, became a condo. I only work in rental buildings because condo boards are notoriously difficult to work with, but I attended a few sessions with the new condo board because I was assisting the new manager with the transition. It was a complete mess of cheap entitled jerks on power trips with no experience in management. However, 2 people in particular were controlling the show and acting like they were experts. They objected to the very affordable maintenance fees, which were what was budgeted in their offering plans, and thought of the most ridiculous ways to save, like asking you to turn off the hallway lights at night, or the emergency exit lights, remove the city-required handicapped lift so they could install a cafe they could charge for, fire the super who was incredibly cheap, yada yada. With a chuckle, I wished the new manager luck dealing with these jerks. The fantastic super I had for part-time supers was fired by the building. Part-time supers are, of course, compensated hourly, and guess what? You will pay more if you pay by the hour for a facility that needs a full-time super. Tenants who called the super for maintenance improvements were actually being yelled at by the president. Building managers kept leaving because they could not handle this BS. In less than a year, they went through 4 of them. I advised some of the former tenants who had just made purchases and were complaining about the cost to call an urgent meeting and remove the board. I informed them that if they did that, I would recommend an excellent manager, but they would need to pledge to follow that manager's instructions. Since then, building has, as far as I know, been profitable. But even so, that was a terrible show. They heeded my advice, and soon the building became solvent. The old idiots left the board, so I kinda helped overthrow an HOA board I didn't even live in. But it was still such an S show. My family moved into a neighborhood with an HOA, and it made sense to have the HOA because there were items that needed to be maintained by the neighborhood but weren't part of anyone's personal property or a county issue. As long as common sense was used, some rules were never enforced according to multiple people who spoke with us. For example, the ratio of vehicles to drivers and job requirements. A few years later, Dad constructs a sizable shed on the property's back, obtains the necessary permits, notifies the HOA, and double-checks the shed's distance from the property line. Nothing gets said. A year and a half later, he makes the decision to run power and extend it further. He doesn't need to draw permits, but out of politeness, he tells the HOA and starts building. A complaint is made 3 months later. The shed, which is now almost a barn, is apparently an eyesore because it is entirely made of aged plywood and isn't painted or sided. The HOA further asserts that the building is too close to the property border and that we were not granted authorization to run water or electrical lines. Dad is alarmed by this because how in the F do they know we have plumbing? And it's more plumbing because it's a sink with water supplied by a rain barrel just to rinse your hands off before walking up to the house. Where the earth slopes away, the drain runs behind the barn. Additionally, they would have had to trespass to properly measure the property border. What else did they measure? The building only needs 10 feet from the property line to the barn, which is 15 feet within the boundary and 5 feet from the fence. Dad responds by providing the board with the measurements and survey from the time he had the property line checked, painted the barn red and white, making it super visible and obvious, provided the board with a copy of their own bylaws that proves the board's power, run, and sink are legal, and then, as a courtesy, provides additional plans for the barn's further expansion that he was on the fence about. He goes to speak with the HOA lawyer, who basically tells him he recommended the board not to pursue this, but they didn't listen, and the lawyer for the HOA files an injunction, I think that's the appropriate term, preventing him from making additional improvements to the building. Dad comes home to discover me, 16 at the time, attempting to run upgraded power wire through the underground conduit, as a person yelling at me to stop while brandishing documents and threatening to call the police is standing over me. Dad had requested me to remove the old power wire and run the new cable because he was concerned that it would not meet the requirements of the building, as it was, or would, only meet the basic minimum and need a safety buffer, let alone when it was upgraded further. Dad didn't like that the HOA guy had physically tried to stop me from working because he believed that because he was so much taller than me, he was stronger than me. However, I carefully pushed him aside and continued working because I respected and feared Dad more than this idiot. Cops are called. The idiot was reminded that just because he's on the HOA board, he does not have the right to trespass, and we would ignore the fact that he touched a child in an effort to get me to leave the area if he promised to never return or to ever speak to me again. This was the equivalent of a voluntary issued restraining order that would not be upheld in court if challenged. Around this time, another member of the board made the decision to begin enforcing the HOA's vehicle bylaw, which essentially allowed for a maximum of 2 vehicles per household. Each household was then allowed to apply annually to add 1 additional vehicle to the property. Each application required a processing fee, which we later learned went to the person processing the applications rather than the HOA's general funds. We were quite soon targeted, including Dad and Mom's truck and SUV, my project vehicle that I worked on every week, Dad's work truck, which wasn't always there but was frequently enough, and Dad's Jeep, which was his frivolous toy and money pit. And we were on the verge of needing another car for my little sister. 5 to 6 cars with a maximum of 7 for a family of 4. To be clear, it's not like they were parked all over the place. We had widened the driveway when we originally moved in to make room for more cars, well within the HOA's restrictions, and all of them, with the exception of my truck, were registered, insured, and roadworthy. In actuality, the Jeep and my vehicle spent the majority of their time at the barn, where all the tools were in the backyard and were hidden from the street. The majority of the vehicles were purchased within a single year, and we intended to file for the exception once we knew what our long-term strategy would be for my car/truck and my sister's possible car. The exception applications were supposed to be submitted after Dad paid his annual fees. But for every one of them, including the irregular appearance of the work truck, we were refused and we were given a monthly fee. So, Dad decides he's had enough, starts going to the public meetings, gets copies of the bylaws, learns as much as he can about the scope of their authority, what they actually do in terms of their actual duties, and may or may not have asked me to go do some late-night spying to see if they were complying with the HOA rules and not exempting themselves, wholly as they were exempting themselves and also allowing public spaces to deteriorate. The next stage was to overthrow the board. He and Mom went door to door conversing with neighbors to gauge their opinions of the HOA, and if they believed they wouldn't expose them, they drafted them into the cause. With 9 months until the next annual election, Dad spoke up at the next public meeting, requested a vote of no confidence, and then showed a PowerPoint presentation outlining the corrupt practices of the board, including pocketing funds, failing to provide maintenance, and disobeying the bylaws when it suited them. The board was caught off guard and attempted to stop us from speaking by turning off the projector, but they gave up when we began to give printouts of the presentation to anyone who was interested, or if they gave me an address, I would personally deliver a physical CD copy of the presentation within a week. Dad was then elected as the new president, a new board was formed, and a new meeting was promised the following month with a list of changes that needed to be approved and a list of tasks that needed to be completed with a priority ranking. The incoming HOA then launched a legal lawsuit against the outgoing board for the money that had been embezzled, as well as monthly penalties accumulated since their election, years, or, if such records existed, most didn't, when the rule had been broken. The full list of tasks that needed to be completed was presented at the following meeting, and a motion to waive some of the former board members' fees was approved, which reduced the civil suit to the point where an out-of-court settlement made more sense. Dad hired me, with board approval, to set up a website to post minutes from monthly executive committee meetings, recordings of all general meetings, operating budgets so people could see where the money was being spent, and a bids report on jobs in the community with notes from the board so they could see why a contractor was chosen over another. This was done to ensure that a situation like this, lack of transparency, never occurred again. Thank you for subscribing, the likes, and the comments. We're very happy to see you all in the comments too. Thanks for your support.